$500,000, Mother, or I'll tell everyone what you've been hiding. That's what my own daughter said to me, my only child, the baby who once wrapped her hand around my thumb like she'd never let go, the same girl I used to carry to the doctor in the middle of the night. When her fevers frightened me more than death itself, she didn't raise her voice or tremble or pause to think whether her words might pierce something tender inside me. She delivered that ultimatum with the chilly precision of a banker announcing a foreclosure, while her manicure glinted under the kitchen light as if even her nails approved of the transaction. And I stood there, 78 years old, a woman who has worked through sickness and loneliness and grief so my daughter could climb into the life she always said she deserved. And I couldn't decide what stunned me more, the number she named or the ease with which she weaponized her knowledge of my past, that one raw piece of memory I had tucked away like a cracked photograph I never meant to revisit. It wasn't a crime, not a scandal, not the sort of thing that ruins reputations. It was simply a scar from a long ago season of survival. But in her mouth, it became ammunition. In her voice, it became a threat. And somehow the threat was worse, because she didn't even seem angry. She looked bored, almost impatient, like a woman settling a bill before brunch. I remember how the window behind her was open, and the garden wind chimes were clinking softly, absurdly cheerful, as if they didn't know a mother was being extorted by her own flesh and blood, in a kitchen where she used to bake birthday cakes so tall. Her daughter could barely blow out all the candles. How strange that the sounds of home, ice machine humming, kettle cooling, refrigerator clicking, continued their little routines while my world shifted on its axis, while the girl I once believed I raised with tenderness revealed she had grown into someone who saw my vulnerability not as something to protect but something to exploit. I had always imagined betrayal as something loud, shouting, slammed doors, broken plates, but it isn't. It's quiet. It's a calm request for $500,000 spoken by someone who knows you don't have it, who knows you will panic because you love them, who knows exactly how to tug the threads of your fear until you unravel all by yourself. She didn't even sit down while she said it. She stood with one hand on the counter, her phone tucked beneath her palm, screen lighting up every few seconds with notifications from people who mattered more to her than I did. I noticed she had rearranged my kitchen again, my spices alphabetized, the mugs color-coordinated, the curtains replaced with ones she claimed were age-appropriate. It was as though she was quietly shifting the bones of my home, making me a visitor. In the rooms I had lived in for more than 40 years, she had been doing this for months, under the guise of helping, but now I understood that this was all of a piece. The small erasures, the persistent corrections, the gentle but relentless positioning of herself as the authority and me as the liability. I thought she wanted order. It turns out she wanted leverage. The worst part is that she didn't always used to be this way. When she was young, she clung to me with the fierce devotion children reserve for the one person they trust without hesitation. She used to curl up in my lap and fall asleep with her ear pressed to my heartbeat, convinced that I was the safest place in the world. I cooked for her, worked overtime for her, sat through parent meetings for her, lied awake at night praying she'd grow into someone kind and brave. I remember her teenage years, when she'd slam doors and swear she hated me, only to creep back into the kitchen at midnight to say she didn't mean it. I remember her 20s, when she called me after every heartbreak, asking me if she was unlovable, asking me what to do with all her disappointment. I remember her 30s, her ambitions, the way she spoke of success as if it were oxygen, and I believed that was just another form of hunger. I fed it. I encouraged it. All the while, I didn't notice the subtle way she stopped considering me a person and started seeing me as a resource. On the day she made her demand, she looked at me like one looks at a malfunctioning appliance, annoyed, inconvenienced, mildly embarrassed to be seen interacting with it. She didn't ask how I was sleeping these days, or whether my hands still stiffened in the mornings, or whether I needed help with the yard work. She didn't ask what the memory meant to me, or how it haunted me long before she was born. She simply named her price and waited. I suppose she expected me to crumble, to plead, to beg her not to expose me. She expected fear. She expected obedience. She expected the old version of me, the mother who said yes to everything, who emptied her pockets and her bones, and her peace just to make her child feel better about life. But something in me refused to blink. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light rested on the kitchen tiles and made everything look too sharp to be softened by lies. Maybe it was the fact that I was tired, bone tired, of decades spent swallowing my own voice. Maybe it was simply that age has stripped me of the illusion that silence is safety. I felt the hum of panic in my chest, but beneath it, something older stirred, something that had been dormant for years, but had once sustained me through the hardest winter of my youth. And I realized, standing there with my daughter's ultimatum hanging between us, that the story she threatened to expose no longer frightened me. What frightened me now was the recognition that the person I had raised did not love me enough to refrain from turning my past into a bargaining chip. I told her I needed some time to think, and she nodded, a small, satisfied nod that made me want to close my eyes and grieve for the woman I used to be and the daughter I thought I had raised. She left my house without looking back, and when the door clicked shut behind her, the silence felt like a truth I had been avoiding for years. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, surrounded by memories she had carefully displaced, and I understood that everything was changing, that the ground beneath me had already given way long before I admitted it. I am 78 years old. I live alone in a house filled with echoes, but that afternoon, after my daughter's threat, after her demand, after her cold certainty that she could bend me to her will, I finally understood something I should have learned decades ago. A secret only controls you when you hide from it. A daughter can only break you when you still believe she wouldn't dare, and fear can only silence you until the moment you decide you have nothing left to lose. I remember the exact moment the truth stopped being an abstract fear and became something with weight and shape, something that settled into the room between us. Like a curtain of smoke you couldn't wave away, because it happened when my daughter returned the next morning without calling, without knocking, stepping into my living room with the brisk entitlement of someone who assumes every door will open. Before she even touches it, she stood there, coat unbuttoned, hair neatly twisted back the way she always did when she wanted to appear competent, rational, composed, and she told me she had already drafted an email to her husband explaining that certain family matters had come up, which was her way of saying she had created an audience before I even had a chance to breathe. That to her was preparation. To me it was warfare. She sat on the edge of my sofa, crossing her legs and smoothing the wrinkles from her trousers with a focused irritation that suggested she was doing something arduous simply by being patient with me. And she said she needed an answer soon because the longer I waited, the more she would have to consider other options. I almost laughed at the phrase, not because it was funny, but because of how absurdly corporate it sounded coming from the mouth of the baby I once rocked through colic nights, the child who needed me to check under her bed for monsters until she was nearly 10 years old. I asked her what exactly she meant by other options, even though I knew. I knew because I had heard that tone in other people, in employers who wanted free overtime, in relatives who pretended their demands were requests, in people who believed kindness was a currency they could counterfeit. She looked at me with that practiced pity she used whenever she felt morally superior and said, "I'll have to tell the truth myself, Mom. People deserve to know who you really are." It was astonishing how gently she said it, as if she were offering me a glass of water instead of threatening to dismantle the life I had spent decades building. And in that gentleness, I saw the full cruelty of her resolve. There is nothing more frightening than a threat delivered softly, because soft threats come from people who believe they are right, and righteousness is a blade sharper than hatred. When she began to describe how she would reveal my secret, posting it online, explaining it to her children in an age-appropriate way, slipping it into conversation during family gatherings, I felt a sensation I hadn't known in years, a cold, tightening in my chest that reminded me of the winter I first lived alone after my husband died. It was the feeling of being suddenly untethered, of realizing that someone you love is willing to unmake you publicly, not because you harmed them, not because they seek justice, but because they believe your vulnerability is currency and they are entitled to collect. She spoke with the measured cadence of someone outlining a business plan, walking me step by step through the consequences she was prepared to unleash. And I listened in silence, not because I agreed or because I feared her judgment, but because I was stunned by the clarity of her intention. She was not angry. She was not desperate. She was executing a strategy. The secret she threatened to expose was not glamorous or sensational. It was the story of a mistake I made decades ago, a moment of human frailty during a time when my world was collapsing in on itself. I was a young widow then, drowning in grief, holding on to the edges of my life like a woman grasping at floating debris after a shipwreck. I trusted someone I shouldn't have trusted, believed words that were never meant to be kept, signed something I didn't fully understand, and paid for it in the currency of shame for years afterward. I carried that memory with the discreet heaviness of an old scar, present, tender, but not defining. I never told my daughter because children don't need to inherit every bruise left on their parents' hearts. But somewhere along the line, she decided that the parts of me I had kept private were weaknesses, not simply history, and she mined those weaknesses like a person hunting for gold in ground they did not cultivate. That morning, when she finally stopped speaking and waited for my response with the expectant stillness of someone who assumed her victory was inevitable, I realized I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a daughter venting frustration. This was a calculated moment of betrayal, the kind that divides a life into before and after. It felt like crossing a threshold into a colder house, one where the walls no longer remember laughter. I understood, with a clarity that made my breath catch, that she had already made her choice. She would sacrifice my dignity for her comfort, my quiet past for her financial security, my trust for her convenience. That decision wasn't made yesterday or today. It had been growing inside her, an idea nurtured by entitlement, until she was finally bold enough to speak it aloud. I walked into the kitchen, needing a moment to gather myself, and she followed, lingering near the table like a shadow that refused to detach. I poured tea with hands that trembled despite my best efforts, and she watched with a mixture of impatience and triumph, the way one watches an opponent they believe is already defeated. She asked again if I had the money, as though $500,000 could be conjured up by willpower or maternal guilt. When I told her no, she sighed dramatically and said she wished she didn't have to push me, but she couldn't keep protecting me forever, as if her threat was an act of noble self-sacrifice rather than exploitation. The phrase lodged in me like a splinter, protecting me. My own daughter believed she was shielding the world from the truth of who I was, when in fact she was shielding herself from the discomfort of acknowledging that her mother was human. She left soon after, frustrated that I didn't fall apart on the spot. I watched her walk down my driveway with the straight-backed confidence of someone who assumes the world will yield to her demands, and I felt the early cold of winter move through me. When the door closed behind her, the house seemed to grow larger and emptier, the silence more precise, like the hush that follows an earthquake before you've checked to see what has been broken. I stood at the window for a long time, staring at the street where she disappeared from view, and I understood that the catalyst wasn't her threat itself, but the realization that she didn't see me anymore, not as a woman, not as a mother, not as a human being with a story worth tenderness. She saw only the version of me she could manipulate, and in that moment, something inside me snapped, not violently, but definitely. I realized she had made her move. Now I would have to make mine. In the days that followed her ultimatum, the air inside my house thickened with a kind of quiet tension I had never known before. Not even in the months after my husband died, when grief clung to the walls like a damp fog that refused to lift, because this time the heaviness didn't come from loss or mourning, but from the growing recognition that my daughter, my own child, was circling me the way a person circles an unlocked safe, testing its hinges, waiting for the moment to pry it open without guilt or hesitation. She didn't contact me at first, and the silence felt strangely orchestrated, as though she wanted to give me time to stew in the worry she had planted, to sit alone with the fear that she might expose the part of my past I had buried so carefully behind the years. I thought the quiet might calm me, give me space to think, but instead it grew into a kind of low-level dread, the sort that hums beneath the skin and keeps you awake at night replaying conversations you wish had ended differently. Every sound in the house seemed sharper, the ticking of the clock more insistent, the creak of the floorboards more accusatory, as if the very structure of my home was echoing a truth I had tried to avoid, that something between my daughter and me had shifted beyond repair. I found myself walking from room to room, touching old photographs, straightening bookshelves, wiping already clean countertops, as though the act of ordering my environment could undo the disarray spreading inside me. I kept remembering the way she looked that morning, her expression cool and calculating, the faint smile she used when she felt she held the upper hand. It unsettled me that I could have raised a woman capable of such deliberate manipulation, and it unsettled me even more that she appeared so certain of my compliance. She had expected me to crumble quickly, to fold under the weight of the threat, and my refusal to respond immediately had only triggered a new tactic: withdrawal, waiting, watching. It was a strategy I had seen before in people who wanted something badly enough to hide their impatience behind feigned detachment. I had not expected to see it in my own child. On the third day, she sent a message so carefully worded it felt like a polished stone, cool and smooth in my palm. Have you thought things through? We don't have to make this difficult, but you can't put it off forever. No greeting, no warmth, no acknowledgement that she was speaking to her mother. The tone was transactional, almost professional, as if we were negotiating a business deal rather than navigating the remains of a relationship. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down without answering. Something inside me resisted giving her the response she wanted, and that resistance surprised me because for most of my life, I had bent myself into the shapes other people needed: dutiful wife, supportive mother, reliable friend, dependable colleague. I had always been the one who compromised first, who apologized even when no apology was necessary, who made room for others without considering the cost to myself. But something about her threat had pierced the old habit clean through. exposing a seam of strength I had forgotten I possessed. Still, the dread didn't fade. It lingered each time the phone buzzed, each time the mail arrived, each time a car slowed on the street outside my house. The fear wasn't of the secret itself, because I had lived long enough to understand that shame loses its power when exposed to daylight. The deeper fear was the knowledge that my daughter was willing to use it against me, that she had crossed a line I could never guide her back from. Late at night, I would sit in my armchair and watch the shadows lengthen across the walls, remembering the moments of tenderness we once shared, wondering when exactly they had evaporated into something cold and transactional. It was almost easier to believe she had been replaced by a stranger than to accept that this transformation had happened slowly, gradually, while I wasn't paying enough attention to the shifting ground beneath us. A week passed before she knocked on my door, a soft, deliberate knock that carried none of the spontaneity of a casual visit. When I opened it, she stood on the porch with a polite smile, so brittle it looked painful, as though she had rehearsed it in the car and couldn't quite maintain the illusion. She didn't wait for an invitation, but stepped inside with the familiar confidence of someone who had long ago claimed every room of my house as her silent inheritance. She commented on how quiet everything seemed, glancing around as though expecting to find evidence of my anxiety scattered across the furniture. I offered tea, out of habit rather than hospitality, and she accepted with the graciousness of a queen, allowing a subject a small reprieve. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to braid her hair for school, where she once colored pictures of flowers and houses and smiling suns, and she began talking as though continuing a conversation we'd been having for months, not days. She asked if I had reached a decision, her tone light, but her eyes sharp, and then she began to nudge, cajole, rationalize. She explained that exposing the secret would be for the best in the long run, that transparency was empowering, that families shouldn't hide things from each other. The hypocrisy of hearing her advocate for honesty while threatening me with humiliation was so staggering I nearly laughed, but I didn't. I only listened, each word tightening something inside me like a thread pulled through a needle. It wasn't what she said that escalated things. It was how she kept slipping little comments into the conversation, remarks that suggested she had already begun altering the narrative in her own mind. She said she was just trying to protect the grandchildren from confusion, implying that I had created danger where none existed. She said she wished she didn't have to do this, as though she were a martyr, sacrificing herself for the greater good. She said she hoped I wouldn't make her look like the villain, even though the only villainy present was her own coercion. And then came the sentence that shifted the ground beneath us entirely. If you can't handle this, Mom, maybe it's time to start thinking about other arrangements for your finances, your living situation, everything. I can't keep managing things alone. It was a subtle threat, wrapped in benevolence, but the implication was unmistakable. If I didn't comply, she would position herself as the responsible daughter forced to take control of her aging mother's life. I had seen this happen to other women, how quickly autonomy could be stripped under the guise of concern. I felt a chill run through me as I realized she wasn't merely pressuring me for money or threatening exposure. She was preparing to recast herself as my guardian, the arbiter of my choices, the manager of my remaining years. It wasn't just my past she wanted to claim, it was my future. She left shortly after delivering that final insinuation, telling me she'd check in soon. And when the door closed behind her, the house felt different again. Not empty now, but invaded, as though her intentions still lingered in the corners, whispering possibilities I hadn't yet dared to consider. I walked through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, brushing my fingers along window frames, grounding myself in the physical reality of the life I had built with my own hands. And in that quiet, something in me hardened, not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet resolve. The escalation had begun, not because she demanded money, but because she had revealed how little she believed I was capable of standing on my own. She thought I would crumble. She thought I would surrender. She thought she knew the measure of my weakness. She had forgotten that I had survived far worse storms than her ambition, and that the part of me she underestimated was the part I had kept hidden longest, not my secret, but my strength. For several nights after her last visit, I found myself waking long before dawn, the kind of waking that isn't caused by noise or nightmares, but by a slow, uneasy realization settling deeper into the bones, the realization that if I didn't take hold of my own life now, I would lose it piece by piece to a woman who believed she had the right to reshape my existence as easily as she rearranged my kitchen cabinets. I would lie in bed, hearing the distant murmur of early birds, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet shifting of the house as it settled into its foundations. And in that stillness, a truth began to rise with a clarity that frightened me at first. I had been living as if my daughter's approval was still something I needed to survive, as if her disappointment could break me, as if her threats could dictate the borders of my world. I had spent so many years placing her comfort above my own that I no longer recognized how deeply I had allowed her to root herself inside my decisions, even the smallest ones. But now, sitting in the half-dark, with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and my hands clasped together as if in prayer, I felt something loosening inside me, a knot I hadn't known existed, unwinding itself thread by slow thread. It happened quietly, without drama or tears, when I reached for a worn cardboard box from the top shelf of my bedroom closet, a box I had moved from house to house across decades without ever fully opening it, the kind of box that contains not treasures but remnants, letters, photographs, documents that belong to the version of yourself you often pretend you have risen above. I carried it to the living room and set it gently on the coffee table, feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. My hands shook as I lifted the lid, not because I feared the contents, but because I feared what revisiting them would demand of me. I had spent half my life hiding that chapter of my past from the world, and the other half pretending it had no claim on my present. And now here I was, opening it of my own will, knowing full well that the truth inside this box was the very truth my daughter had promised to use against me. I pulled out the first envelope, yellowed and brittle at the edges, addressed to me in a handwriting I once adored and later learned to distrust. The words inside were familiar, each line a reminder of a love that had felt like rescue at the time, but had ended in humiliation and loss, not because I was naive or foolish, but because I had been human in a moment when my world had cracked open. Beneath me, I read every letter, letting the memories wash over me without shrinking from them, understanding them now with the compassion age sometimes grants, the compassion you rarely receive from others when you are young and vulnerable. I found documents I had signed under pressure, receipts for payments I should never have been asked to make, and one final letter I had written to myself years later, promising that I would forgive the woman I had been, that I would carry her forward with gentleness. I realized I had broken that promise. I had treated myself with more judgment than I ever would have shown another woman. And there, beneath the papers, lay the photograph I had feared most, proof of a moment I had let define my shame, though it was simply evidence of survival. As I held the photograph, A thought came to me with the force of revelation. I was no longer willing to live under the weight of something that no longer held power over me. My daughter had assumed the secret still had the ability to silence me, that I was still the frightened woman who had buried that photo at the bottom of a box and prayed no one would ever find it. But sitting there in the early morning light, the sky gradually tinting the windows with pale blue, I saw the truth with astonishing clarity. The shame was gone. The wound had healed. The only thing left was the story, and the story belonged to me, not to my daughter, not to anyone who would twist it for their own gain. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stirring of something bold inside me, not defiance, not rage, but a quiet, steady insistence that I had the right to tell my own life on my own terms. I made myself tea and sat at the small wooden desk where I used to write grocery lists and holiday cards, and without pausing to question the impulse, I began to write. The words flowed not with urgency, but with the calm certainty of someone who has carried a truth long enough to know exactly where its edges lie. I wrote the story of that younger version of myself, not as a confession, but as a testament to her endurance, describing the grief that had hollowed me out, the loneliness that had driven me to someone unworthy, the decisions made in desperation rather than malice. I wrote about the consequences, the lessons, the slow rebuilding of my life. I wrote in a voice that was gentle toward the woman I had been, a voice my daughter had never bothered to learn. By midday, I had pages stacked beside me, each one carrying a little more of the weight I had been holding for decades. I didn't write to justify myself. I didn't write to seek forgiveness. I wrote because the story, told honestly, no longer frightened me, and because telling it on my terms felt like reclaiming a part of myself she had tried to weaponize. When I finished, I didn't tremble as I thought I might. I didn't cry. I felt an extraordinary stillness. The kind that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. I placed the pages in a neat stack, reread the first few lines, and understood with sudden vivid certainty what I would do next. If my daughter believed she held power over me through knowledge, then I would dismantle that illusion by making the knowledge public. Not as a spectacle, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of liberation, I would share my story openly, somewhere simple and unadorned, a place where my voice could exist without interception or distortion. The thought terrified me for a single heartbeat, and then, to my astonishment, it steadied me instead. The fear belonged to the past. The courage belonged to the present. I went to my bedroom, changed into a clean blouse, and looked at myself in the mirror. Looked truly, without the harsh lens I had adopted from years of trying to appease people who wanted me smaller, quieter, simpler. The woman staring back at me did not look fragile or ashamed. She looked tired, yes, and older than she once was, but she also looked capable of truth. She looked ready. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt the faint glow of possibility expanding in my chest, as if the walls of my life were being pushed outward to make space for something new. I gathered my pages, my photograph, the letters, and set them beside my computer. I didn't post anything that day, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the act to be deliberate, not impulsive. I wanted to choose the moment, to honor it as a turning point, not a reaction. When evening settled and the cicadas began their low chorus outside my window, I sat again at my desk, lit a lamp, and looked at the story I had written. I saw not a confession but a bridge, one that carried me from the woman my daughter believed she controlled to the woman I was finally reclaiming. I understood then that whatever happened next, this was the moment everything shifted, the midpoint where fear loosened its grip, and truth became not a threat, but a path. and for the first time since my daughter's ultimatum, I felt something warm settle inside me. The sense that I was stepping toward my life, not away from it, and that perhaps the secret was never the burden, it was the silence. In the days that followed my decision to write the truth in my own words, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of someone who knows the storm has already chosen its path, and that hiding from it will no longer change its course. I went about my routines with a kind of heightened awareness, noticing the texture of the morning light on the kitchen tiles, the way the kettle hissed before boiling, the familiar creak of the third step on the staircase, and though everything around me remained exactly as it always had been, I felt the subtle tremor of something shifting beneath the surface. There was no going back to the version of myself who tried to appease my daughter, no returning to the quiet rhythm of a life shaped by her expectations. I had crossed a line simply by choosing to speak the truth to myself, and the knowledge of that change pressed against me with equal parts dread and strength. I suspected she felt it too, even from a distance, because her silence, which had once seemed calculated, now carried an edge of anticipation, like the pause before a blade falls. I posted my story one evening just before the sun disappeared, choosing a time when the world seemed distracted and people were finishing their dinners or settling into the soft mindlessness of nightly routines. I didn't announce it with warnings or apologies. I simply placed my truth where anyone could see it, not as a spectacle, but as a final act of ownership. I didn't attach explanations. I didn't mention names, and I didn't speak of my daughter. I spoke only of myself, of the woman I had been, of the choices I had made during a grief-stricken chapter that nearly swallowed me. And I spoke of survival not as triumph, but as endurance. The moment I clicked post, a shiver ran down my spine, not unlike the sensation of stepping into cold water, shocking, yet cleansing, and though part of me expected regret to bloom inside my chest, nothing came. Instead, there was an almost unbearable stillness, the kind that seeps into a house after a long-avoided truth has finally been spoken. I closed the laptop and went to bed early, unsure whether I would sleep or lie awake listening for the repercussions. When I woke the next morning, my heart was unsteady, as though it knew something monumental had shifted even before my mind caught up. I brewed coffee with trembling hands, delaying the moment I would check the reaction. But before I could gather the courage, the phone lit up with 3 messages from friends I hadn't spoken to in months. Short notes of recognition, gratitude, quiet, solidarity. None asked for details, none pried. They simply wrote, "Thank you for telling your story," or "I understand more than you know." It was the kind of response that softens something inside a person, the kind that acknowledges not the drama of the story, but the dignity of telling it. I sat at the table reading their words, feeling an unexpected warmth unfurl slowly in a place that had felt cold for so long. But that warmth lasted only briefly, because I knew my daughter would read it too, and her reaction would not echo the kindness of strangers. She didn't call that first day, which surprised me. I expected a storm, fury, accusations, demands, but instead I heard nothing. And silence, when it comes from someone who thrives on control, is never absence. It is preparation. By evening, I felt the tension building like static in the walls, and I forced myself to remain steady, reminding myself that truth is not a weapon unless someone is intent on using it as one. The next morning, she arrived unannounced, stepping through the doorway with an expression so tightly contained I knew she must have rehearsed it in the car. She stood in the center of my living room, not removing her coat, not sitting, just looking at me with eyes that were too wide and too dry, as though she refused to blink in case softness slipped through. Her first words were not a greeting, but an accusation so sharp it cut the space between us. "You humiliated me." She didn't say she was hurt by my story. She didn't say she felt betrayed. She didn't ask why. She simply declared that my act, an act of reclaiming myself, was an injury inflicted on her. I told her gently that I had not mentioned her, that the story was mine alone, but she waved her hand sharply, dismissing my explanation as though facts were beneath her concern. She said it didn't matter what I wrote or didn't write, because people would connect the dots, because she had friends who would assume things, because her children might ask questions, and because she now had to manage the fallout. She spoke as though my life existed as a footnote in hers, as though my truth required her approval to be valid, as though my history was something she needed to curate in case it disrupted the fictional narrative she had created for herself. She leaned closer and hissed that I had forced her hand, that now she had no choice but to tell her side, which struck me with an odd kind of sadness, because there was no side for her to tell, no alternative version of my past that belonged to her, no truth she possessed that could justify what she was preparing to do. She was not defending a boundary. She was defending her control. In that moment, I saw how deeply she feared my autonomy, how much she depended on my silence, not for my sake, but for the shape of her own identity. She told me she had already spoken to her husband, that he was concerned, that he felt misled, though I suspected his concern was less about my past and more about the inconvenience of its emergence. She said she was considering telling the story herself with context, which I knew meant with distortion, because she had long ago learned that framing a narrative is far more powerful than merely telling it. I watched her pace in my living room, her footsteps sharp and impatient, her words spilling faster and louder, and I felt a strange detachment growing in me, as though she were a stranger rehearsing lines in a play whose script I had not agreed to. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was no longer reacting to my story itself, but to the loss of leverage it caused. I had undone the tool she hoped to use against me, and now she was scrambling to rebuild it out of fragments of fear. The escalation came subtly, like a sudden shift in temperature rather than a clap of thunder. She stopped pacing, planted herself in front of me, and said in a voice that was eerily calm, "If you won't think about how your actions affect me, then maybe I need to think about what legal steps to take." I stared at her, unsure whether I had heard correctly, but she continued, explaining that she was worried about my judgment, that she felt I was making impulsive decisions, and that she might need to speak to a lawyer about protecting the family. The insinuation slid into the room like a draft. She was threatening to challenge my independence, to claim I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs, to position herself as the responsible daughter forced to intervene. I had seen this happen to women my age, perfectly capable, lucid women gradually stripped of their autonomy under the pretext of care, and the realization that my daughter was willing to use that tactic against me made my stomach twist with a cold, hollow sickness. I felt a tremor pass through me, not of fear, but of clarity. She looked at me with a softness that was entirely fabricated, the same expression she used when she wanted to appear compassionate in public settings, and said she was looking out for me, as though her threats were benevolent acts and my resistance was a symptom of confusion. In that moment, she didn't resemble the child I had raised. She resembled someone who believed kindness was weakness and control was love. I understood with devastating certainty that she would not hesitate to undermine my independence if it meant regaining the upper hand. She left abruptly, saying she needed to consult professionals, leaving the faint perfume of her expensive cologne hanging in the air like a reminder of the world she valued more than she valued me. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any silence I had ever known. I felt something inside me break, not a fracture that causes collapse, but a fracture that releases pressure, the kind that allows a structure to finally settle into a new shape. I walked slowly to the kitchen, holding onto the back of chairs as though learning to move through my own home for the first time. And when I reached the sink, I gripped the counter and let the truth wash through me. My daughter had escalated her threat into a plan. For the first time in my life, I understood that love was not enough to protect me, that history was not enough to soften her, that motherhood did not earn safety, and that silence had allowed her to grow into a person who believed she could orchestrate my life to suit her needs. I stood there a long time, listening to the hollow thrum of the refrigerator, the distant hum of traffic, the faint rattle of wind against the window pane, and I knew what I needed to do next. I had thought the midpoint was the act of reclaiming my story, but I realize now that reclaiming it was only preparation. The true escalation had begun, and it demanded something more than courage. It demanded a willingness to sever the last threads of dependence that still tied me to the version of myself she believed she could command. I dried my hands slowly, folded the dish towel with deliberate care, and in the silence that followed, I understood with a final, startling clarity, my daughter was preparing for battle. And this time, I would not be entering it unarmed. The morning I decided to act did not arrive with fanfare or dread, but with a stillness so complete it felt like the world itself was pausing to watch, as if the air in my house, the thin winter light leaking through the curtains, even the dust, floating in quiet spirals above the floor, understood that a boundary I had tolerated for years was about to vanish forever. I woke before the sun, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been since my daughter first delivered her threat, and I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, realizing how strange it was that something as fragile as courage often disguised itself as a kind of ordinary calm. I didn't feel young or triumphant or defiant. I felt like a woman who had finally grown tired of being rearranged, repurposed, and interpreted by someone who believed my life was raw material she had the right to shape. When I stood, my knees ached as they always did. My back stiffened in its familiar protest, but beneath those aches was a steadiness that belonged not to youth, but to age, the strength of someone who has survived too much to be frightened by the last demand of a daughter who underestimated her. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, opening the folder I had prepared the night before, the one containing every message my daughter had sent, each threat, each manipulative remark, each subtle attempt to position herself as my guardian rather than my equal. I read them one by one, not to torment myself, but to remind myself that this was not a moment born of impulsivity or spite, but of necessity. She had crossed every line a child can cross with a parent, and now she was threatening to strip away my autonomy under the guise of concern. I realized then that silence would no longer protect me. Silence had become the very thing she relied on to tighten her control. So I placed the printed pages in a neat stack, attached the summary I had written, and tucked them into a manila envelope. My hands did not tremble. For the first time, the truth felt lighter than fear. Around 10 in the morning, I walked to my car, the winter air sharp against my cheeks, and drove to the attorney's office, whose number I had found through a local support group for seniors. The receptionist greeted me with the same warm professionalism she would offer anyone, and though part of me feared she would look at my age and assume confusion or fragility, she did not. She treated me as a woman with agency, with clarity, with purpose. When the attorney, a quiet man with gentle eyes, invited me into his office, I sat across from him and placed the envelope on his desk, explaining exactly what my daughter had threatened and the lengths she had implied she was willing to pursue. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I told him the truth in steady, measured sentences, and as I spoke, I felt the room shift in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. For so long, I had carried my daughter's shadow as if it were a second spine, but as he read through the messages, pausing occasionally to make notes, I realized I was finally stepping out of that shadow and into a space where her power could not reach unchecked. When he finished reading, he looked at me with a seriousness that held no pity, only professional concern, and told me I had done the right thing. He said he would file the necessary papers to establish a protective record, documents confirming my mental competence, statements establishing that any attempt to challenge my autonomy would appear retaliatory rather than justified. He explained the process calmly, the way a doctor explains a procedure meant to restore what should never have been threatened in the first place. And I felt a weight lift from my chest, not because the danger had passed, but because I finally had help structure, a way forward that did not rely on placating the very person who meant to take control of my life. Before I left, he placed the envelope in a secure file and told me he would handle the rest. As I walked out of the building, the winter sun had brightened, casting long beams of light across the pavement, and for the first time in months, I inhaled without feeling as if my ribs were closing in around my lungs. But the true climax came later that afternoon, when I returned home and found my daughter waiting for me on the front porch, her posture stiff, her face pale with a rage she was trying and failing to disguise beneath a veneer of wounded dignity. She demanded to know where I had been, as though I owed her an itinerary, and when I did not answer, she followed me inside, closing the door with the soft, ominous finality of someone preparing to corner their opponent. She launched into accusations. The story I posted was irresponsible. It embarrassed her. It created complications she now had to manage. But her voice faltered when she noticed the new documents on my counter, the official letterhead, the signatures, the unmistakable weight of something lawful. She asked what they were, her voice tightening in panic, and I looked at her not with anger, but with the quiet strength I had spent my entire life forgetting I possessed. I told her, calmly, clearly, without blame, that I had consulted an attorney. I told her I had documented everything. I told her that any attempt to claim I was unfit, confused, unstable, or incapable would be seen for what it was, retaliation for losing the leverage she believed entitled her to $500,000. I told her that I would no longer be threatened, manipulated, or controlled, and that any further attempts would be handled legally, not emotionally. For a moment she simply stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she were seeing me for the first time, not as her mother, not as the woman she had slowly cornered over the years, but as someone she could no longer bend. Her face shifted from shock to disbelief to something like fear, though she masked it quickly with indignation. She accused me of choosing outsiders over family, of betraying her, of making a big mistake. But the words no longer clung to me the way they once had. They slid off like water on metal because I had already chosen my truth over her permission. When she finally realized I was unmoved, her confidence cracked. She grabbed her coat, muttering something about talking to her husband, about figuring out her next steps, but I sensed she already understood. Her grip had loosened permanently. She stood at the doorway, her hand trembling on the knob, and for one fleeting second, I saw the child she once was, confused and angry and lost. But I also saw the woman she had become, one who believed control was the only form of love she knew how to offer. She left without looking back, and when the door closed behind her, I felt a silence sweep through the house, not heavy this time, but clean, like the moment right after a storm when the air changes shape and the horizon becomes visible again. I walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, and drank slowly, feeling the coolness settle into my chest. I was alone, yes, and uncertain of what the future with my daughter would look like. But I was no longer living in fear of her choices. I stood in my own home, in my own life, in my own truth, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the profound steadiness of a woman who had reclaimed not just her story, but her dignity. I knew nothing would ever be the same, but perhaps that was the point. The climax wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the realization that I had finally become someone my daughter could no longer rewrite. The truth was mine. The future was mine. And the silence that followed was no longer the silence of being silenced, but the silence of beginning again. In the weeks that followed my daughter's departure from my doorstep, the house settled into a quieter rhythm, not the hollow quiet of abandonment, but the gentle, steady quiet of a place finally allowed to breathe after years of being crowded by unspoken tension and the constant fear of disappointing someone who had long ago stopped listening. I moved through my days with a slowness that was not weakness, but intention, noticing small things I had forgotten to notice, the way the afternoon sun painted long stripes across the living room rug, the creak of the old rocking chair when I leaned into it with a book, the way the kettle sometimes whistled before fully boiling as if urging me to sit and rest. At first, the stillness felt unfamiliar, edged with a faint ache, because even a toxic pattern leaves an imprint, and breaking free of it creates a strange kind of spaciousness that can feel like loss before it feels like freedom. But as the days stretched forward, I realized I was rediscovering parts of myself I had neglected, gentle pieces that had been overshadowed by the weight of my daughter's expectations. She didn't contact me during that time, though she sent one careful message to say she needed space, which I read not as punishment, but as confirmation that she had finally encountered a boundary she did not know how to navigate. For the first time, I did not rush to soften the distance, did not reach out with apologies or explanations designed to soothe emotions she had weaponized for so long. Instead, I let the silence stand between us, not as a wall, but as a breathing space, a place where clarity might grow if she ever chose to look inward rather than outward for someone to blame. I did not wish her harm. I did not relish our distance. I simply allowed the quiet to exist, trusting that truth once spoken does not need to be defended with further noise. One afternoon, as I was trimming the dead branches from the rose bush near the porch, I heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see my grandson standing a few feet away, awkward and uncertain, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, as though he had borrowed the posture from someone older than himself. He didn't know what to say at first, and I didn't press him. Eventually, he admitted he had read my story online, that he didn't know everything about what had happened, but that he wanted to see me anyway, not out of pity, but out of genuine curiosity, as if he were meeting me anew instead of remembering the grandmother who used to sneak him extra slices of pie when his mother wasn't watching. He told me he was proud of me, and the words were so unexpected in their simplicity that they loosened something inside me, a knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I invited him in, and as we sat together over tea, I felt the first small roots of healing planting themselves quietly in the soil between us. After he left, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Sometimes the relationship that survives a storm is not the one you fought hardest to maintain, but the one that emerges from the debris, willing to learn, willing to listen, willing to see you as you truly are. I didn't know whether my daughter would ever reach that place within herself, whether she would ever have the courage to face her own reflection without blaming mine for the shadows she saw. But I also understood that her journey was no longer mine to manage, and that relinquishing that responsibility felt less like letting go and more like stepping back into the natural shape of my own life. As winter shifted slowly toward spring, I began to spend more time outside, tending to the garden that had long been waiting for my attention. I pruned, watered, replanted, the small rituals grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years, reminding me that growth is rarely dramatic. It is slow, patient, quiet. Sometimes, while I worked, I thought of my daughter, not with bitterness, but with the soft ache of a mother who knows love does not dissolve simply because trust has shattered. I hoped she would someday understand the harm she caused, not so she could apologize, but so she could free herself from the version of love that taught her control was safer than vulnerability. I did not need her forgiveness, and I did not need to offer mine, because forgiveness, I had learned, is not always a two-way bridge. Sometimes it is simply the act of releasing someone from the role they played in your story so you can walk forward without dragging their unfinished lessons behind you. In the evenings, I would sit by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sky fade into shades of lavender and deep blue, and I felt a quiet peace settle through my chest, the peace of a woman who has reclaimed her name, her history, her breath. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, friends, acquaintances from church, who had whispered their own stories of daughters or sons who used love as leverage, who demanded obedience as proof of devotion. I wished I could tell each of them what I finally understood, that survival is not measured by how long you can endure someone else's cruelty, but by the moment you decide to stop shrinking beneath it. And so, sipping my tea as the first stars appeared, I imagined speaking to one of them directly, offering the words I had once needed myself. You are not defined by the version of you that someone else tries to control. You are defined by the moment you choose yourself, even if your voice trembles when you do. As night settled fully and the house grew still once more, I felt an undeniable truth anchoring itself gently within me. I was not the woman my daughter believed she could corner. I was not the sum of my mistakes or the shape of my silence. I was a woman who had walked through grief, through manipulation, through the slow erosion of trust, and had emerged with her dignity intact. And though I did not know what the future held, whether reconciliation or distance or something in between, I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it on my terms, not through fear, but through the strength I had rediscovered. The final realization was simple, quiet, and profoundly freeing. Sometimes the story you fear the world will judge is the very story that saves you. And sometimes the boundary you draw to protect yourself becomes the first doorway into a life that finally belongs entirely to you.